I'm Dee Michael, and I formerly from Grant County, Oregon. I lived in a little town called Prairie City, just east of John Day, Oregon. I've now moved, but I was there for 10 to 12 years. I think I moved there in about 2000. And my daughter, Debbie Meekum, and her husband, Rick Meekum, had 4 kids, and I moved over there to help my daughter raise the grandkids because she was having health issues. And so while I was over there, I got to noticing selective prosecution, withholding of exculpatory evidence, all kinds of good stuff that was going on there, especially with the teenagers. And that bothered me because my grandsons were teenagers. And so the first real problem I had was with the oldest boy, Hezekiah. He was 19, and a 14, 15-year-old girl told somebody that she had spent the night with him in a bunkhouse. Well, at the time he was with his wife. They had a little boy about 18 months old. And Hezekiah was staying in a bunkhouse with another guy by the name of Joe, and they was working on a ranch. And these 2 gals showed up to visit with Joe, and the younger girl took a liking to Hezekiah, and he knew that she was trouble right from the first time he met her. He knew that she was trouble, and so he didn't want anything to do with her. But they came in drunk, the girls did, they were drunk, and that younger girl kept trying to sit on his lap and wrap herself around him, and he kept shoving her, and he ended up throwing her across the room as she bounced off the wall, he said. And so he ended up getting into a fight with Joe, and he went out to sleep in the back of a station wagon on the ranch there. But his baby was in the playpen because he was taking care of him that night because his wife worked the night shift. Candace was her name, is her name. And so the next morning, Candace called, and that young girl answered the phone, and she said, "Where is Hezekiah?" And she said, "Oh, he's out in the station wagon. He slept out there." Well, Candace immediately got in her car and came up to the ranch to see what was going on, and she went in, and Hezekiah was not in the bunkhouse. She did go out and find him asleep in the back of a station wagon, thank goodness, because she had to testify to that when it came to court. A couple months later, that girl alleged that she had spent the night on the top bunk with Hezekiah. Well, come to find out that she had herpes, and her dad was pissed because he was having to pay the medical bills, and he told her that she was going to name whoever gave her herpes. So she named Hezekiah, not the guy that she was actually having sex with, and she named Hezekiah, and they arrested Hezekiah. So he was in jail there in Grant County, and he had Mr. Sorio was his court-appointed attorney. And at one point, Mr. Sorio went to the district attorney, Mr. Carter, and he told him, he said, "You need to dismiss charges against my client because he has taken 2 different medical tests, and he does not have herpes. He's clean. He's never had herpes." And Mr. Carter just said, "I know he slept with that girl, and by God, I'm going to take him down." Well, it went to trial. Thank goodness, a jury of 6 women found him not guilty. They found this girl and her friend actually lying on the stand. So it was a real relief, yes, that he was found not guilty, because that could have ruined his life. He would have been a prisoner. He would have been a registered sex offender for life. So that was quite a relief that he was found not guilty. 2 months after that, my second grandson, who was 15 years old, his name's Drew, he came to me, threw himself over me because he was about 6'4" at the time at 15 years old. He's 6'6" now. But he was crying. He had just gone down to the police station because some kids had told him that Jim Wood, the police officer there in Prairie City, wanted to talk to him. So he went down there and was trying to talk to Jim Wood, and Jim Wood just said, "You're under arrest for rape of Ms. McKenzie." Well, Ms. McKenzie happens to be Drew's half-sister. They both had the same biological father. Their father was killed in a logging accident up towards Oak Ridge when Drew was 8 and Mackenzie was 6. Mackenzie had a different mother because my daughter never married Drew's father, Joe Portugal. But they remained friends, and Debbie married Rick, and Rick and Joe were good friends. And so Debbie did babysit his two girls. He got custody of the divorce of his two girls, Katie and Mackenzie. And so Debbie babysat him a lot when the guys were working and stuff, and logging. And so when I got home from work one day and there was a message on my machine in Springfield, my phone machine, saying, "Mom, Joe's been hurt in the woods. He's in the hospital, Sacred Heart Hospital. I've taken Mackenzie, Katie, and Drew to the hospital from Cottage Grove. I've left the other kids, which there was maybe 4 or 5 other kids she had that day, with a friend. And could I please go get the kids?" Well, the next message was, "Mom, Joe's not going to live. You've got to go get the kids and bring them to the hospital to say goodbye." So I took off and went down and got the other 3 kids and brought them to the hospital. It was a very traumatic experience because we knew he was not going to live. And so it was hard on the kids. It was really hard on the kids. Mackenzie was a daddy's girl. She was daddy's baby. Well, it just so happened Joe had a twin brother who was an identical twin brother that had been living with him, helping him with the girls. Well, that brother got custody of those 2 girls when Mackenzie was 6 and Katie was 9. Well, after that, Rick and Debbie moved away, and they ended up in Prairie City, Oregon, with their kids. And that's when Drew was 8 years old. Or no, 10. She had 2 younger ones than Drew. It was Marshall and Solana, was 2 younger kids, younger than Drew. Anyhow, they ended up in Prairie City, Oregon. And so when Drew was 50, that's when this happened, when Drew was 15. He was, first thing I knew was Debbie called me. She was hysterical that the police was there, the CSD case workers there at the house on the ranch, and that they either were going to take Drew and put him in a foster home, or they were going to take Solana and Marshall and put them in foster homes. They would not allow Drew to live in the house with Solana and Marshall. So when Debbie called me hysterical, I told her, "Calm down, my grandkids aren't going anywhere." I said, "Drew will come live with me and his Uncle Larry," because I was taking care of my brother, who was a disabled man at the time. And so it was arranged that Drew would live with us, and he couldn't live at home because he was a danger to Solana and Marshall. He could go out there with me to visit the family, but he could not stay all night. And so that pretty much tore the family up. Marshall hates the police because of what they did to his brother, and Solana was 9 years old, I believe, maybe 10 at that time. She was so traumatized by her big brother, who had always been her protector. Her big brother was taken away. She was so traumatized that for at least 3 months, anytime Debbie walked out of their bedroom, they stumbled over Solana, because she'd take her bedding and put it in front of their door and sleep on her bedding in the floor. She was afraid to sleep in her own room, because if they could take her big brother, what could they do with her? So yes, it was very traumatic for Solana. So this problem went on for about a year almost, with Drew's problem, him living with me, and us trying to communicate with Jim Wood, who was the police officer there in town. He had been born and raised there. He was their police officer, so whatever he decided to do, he could do it. And I talked to older women in that town, and they said when he was a teenager, he was a bully with the little kids. And now that he was an adult, he was a bully with the teenagers. Well, he happened to bully the wrong grandmother's grandson. So I tried to talk to him. He wouldn't communicate with us at all. He wouldn't listen to any witnesses we had as to what was wrong with Miss Mackenzie. Why was she doing what she was doing? She was Drew's half-sister. She had brought these allegations of digital rape against her own half-brother. Well, the thing of it is, when you're accused, whatever the reason, it's just crazy. It was crazy in that This police officer wouldn't accept written statements from other people in town about other things that Miss Mackenzie was doing. Debbie and myself had wondered why Mackenzie changed at, say, 12 years old, because her uncle had moved there when she was probably 8, 9 years old. He moved over there with the two girls to raise them with Drew as brothers and sisters. They lived in different houses, but they grew up together. They had been together since they was babies. And so Uncle Chris lived right across the street from the high school where Drew was an athlete. And he went to spend the night one time for an early game, an away game, that the bus left about 5 o'clock in the morning. So he stayed at Uncle Chris's, sleeping on the couch to catch the bus the next morning. Well, that's where this problem stemmed from. Mackenzie stayed out after curfew. Uncle Chris came down hard on her when she came in. She was angry. She went to her bedroom. Well, she ended up telling a dirty story about Drew. Why? I don't know. Get attention, maybe. Her uncle was a full-blown drug addict. We tried to get help for her through CSD. We knew the problem in the home. And when we started getting statements from other kids around town about Mackenzie's private life, we were very upset because we knew there was a problem with her, but we didn't know why there was a problem with her. But other teenagers were willing to write statements. So probably 4 or 5 of them wrote handwritten statements pertaining to what they knew about Miss Mackenzie's private life, and that she had said her uncle had taught her about her body when she was 12 years old, and that he had started with her breasts, and he had ended up having intercourse with her to teach her about sex. We didn't know about that at the time, but Debbie and I had discussed as to what had happened to Mackenzie because she seemed to change at about that age. I said, a girl just doesn't wake up and decide she's going to be a slut. But we could, you know, it was very confusing to us for a couple of years before this incident happened with Drew. And so I tried to go down and talk to Jim Wood and tell him that I thought something was wrong in the home. He wouldn't even talk to me. I took a couple of kids over to him and I said, you need to talk to these kids about what's going on. And I walked out. I said, I'm going to leave here because I'm not going to have you saying that I am influencing what they're telling you. They are willing to talk to you and tell you what they know about the situation. So I walked out. Later I asked those two, what did Jim say to you after I left? They said nothing. He just said, I'm not talking to you guys. The only ones I'm going to talk to is Drew and Mackenzie. He wouldn't talk to anybody else. And so Debbie went to gathering up written statements from different kids. And a couple of girls came to me one day and they said, Dee, we need to tell you that when Mackenzie was about 13, her Uncle Chris bought her a four-wheeler out on the ranch. And she went into town on her four-wheeler one day. And when she got back, he was mad. He took a piece of a horse harness and beat her. And those two girls told me that they had seen her at that time, and she was almost as dark as my blue-black pickup, they said, from the back of her back to the back of her knees. Only they hadn't told because you know how kids are with confidences or something. They just hadn't told at the time. And so we were getting these kinds of stories about why Mackenzie might be doing what she was doing. And I had had an experience with her Uncle Chris myself right after he moved there over the telephone. He was so angry that he just went crazy. He was cussing me. He was calling me filthy names. And I'm the grandmother to his 2 granddaughters at the time. Yeah. I mean, his 2 kids. And I couldn't understand why he was going bonkers on me the way he was. But it scared me so bad that I was crying. And I don't cry easy. Thank goodness my son-in-law walked in the house while this was going on, and he took over the phone, and he managed to get things diffused. And he turned and told me, he said, Dee, don't try to contend with Chris. He said, he's just that way. And I said, well, why didn't somebody tell me he was that way? I had no idea he was. I didn't know the guy before he moved over there with those 2 girls. Needless to say, for the last 6 or 8 years, I haven't even spoken hi to the guy. Want nothing to do with him. But those girls were tied in that house with him being capable of coming totally unglued because he has destroyed brain cells with drugs all of his life. I find out that he's been on heavy drugs ever since he was a teenager, and he's 50-some years old. So I couldn't rescue those kids from him, even though I took statements to CSD and John Day. They told me that they would take Mackenzie out of the home, because Katie had already grown up and married by that time, so they told me they'd take Mackenzie out of the home until they could investigate. They never took her out of that home. I went back another time, a month or so later, said, why is she still in that home? They says, we went and visited, we couldn't see anything wrong in that home. So they left her there. So I wrote a letter to the district attorney, Mrs. Timko. By that time, Carter had quit after he couldn't convict my grandson Hezekiah. He quit and went back to Grants Pass or wherever he came from, and Ms. Timko took over as interim DA. And so I wrote her, and I sent her a copy of the letter. I sent CSD a copy of the letter. I presented another officer to present to Jim, because by that time I wasn't on speaking terms with Jim Wood. And so I gave it to a reserve police officer to give to him, telling them that from what I could see as to the way I was treated by this Uncle Chris, that if Mackenzie admitted she told a dirty story on her brother Drew, who was a good fishing buddy with his Uncle Chris, that he might even come unglued and kill her. He could lose control of his emotions and actually kill her if she admitted she told a dirty story on Drew. I don't think she intended for that dirty story to get to the police. She had told dirty stories on other young men in that town prior to that could have gotten them arrested. Because they were above 18, she was under 18. So she just liked to get attention by telling dirty stories. Well, when she told a dirty story on Drew to her girlfriends, the one girl had an adult sister, and she went to her sister and told her what Mackenzie was telling on Drew. That woman, not knowing the kids, which she called the police, made a report. That's how the report got to the police about Drew, which it hadn't with the other ones that she told stories on. And so I tried to tell him that she was scared of him. I knew she had to be scared of him because of the fact that he had beat her with a horse harness. He had maybe sexually molested her. Who knows? But if she had admitted to this Uncle Chris that she had told a dirty story on his dead identical twin brother's only son, the man might have killed her. He really might have lost it completely and killed that girl. So what we did was, Debbie got all these kids to sign statements, write out statements in their own handwriting, sign them. She did type out Drew's statement on the computer and had Drew sign it. She did do another boy by the name of Williams. She went to his grandmother's house. His father was there. She talked to him, and he told her what he knew about things Mackenzie had been doing with other boys around town and stuff, and how bad things were with Mackenzie when she was drunk and everything. And so Debbie went home, typed it up, brought it back. The grandmother was there. The father was there. She got their permission to have him sign this statement. They agreed to it, and he signed it. So Debbie presented, she tried to present these statements to Jim Wood there in town. He just said, I'm not accepting it. I've already turned in my report. He had. We found out he had done his report and sent it in to Mrs. Timko within maybe the first week or two of this happening, and here we're 3 or 4 months into this. And so I told Debbie, I said, take it to Miss Timko at the courthouse. So she took all these statements in a brown manila envelope, and she tried to give them to Miss Timko's assistant. She went in the back room, came back and says, Miss Timko is not going to take this. She says, this is a civil matter. This is a police matter or something. She wouldn't accept it. So I told Debbie, I said, go back and hand it to her in person, and don't take no for an answer. So Debbie went back, and she gave her this envelope with all these statements in it. Well, we didn't hear anything from her. So I was getting pretty angry by that time. And so I went down to try to talk to Jim Wood again. Mackenzie was in the park. She came unglued on me, was screaming, he raped me, he raped me. I have to live with a baseball bat beside my bedroom door. I said, Mackenzie, why are you lying on your own brother? You know, and so anyhow, Jim came out of the police station with a couple of other men, and they got Miss McKenzie in their arms, and they escorted her into the town hall there, and he turned to me and said, if you don't go home and cool down, he said, you're on some kind of a tangent here, and if you don't go home, I'm going to arrest you, put you in the back of that police car, and I'm going to take you to jail. And I said, that kid needs some help, Jim. And if you won't let me do it, then you help her. And I just went walking off across the park. And I decided I'd had about enough about that time. So I went to a secondhand store in John Day. I got a cosmetology head for men where the people, you know, they cut their beards and hair at cosmetology shops. I got one of those heads, and I went home and I dressed it. I didn't have a police uniform, so I dressed it in sweatsuit and stuff, and I hung a placard around the neck saying Officer Wood. And I put a pole up beside my driveway and an arm out, and I got a rope about that big around, and I twisted it around 13 times because I think that's what you're supposed to do. And I hung him on the gatepost. And the funny thing about that is where he lived over 2 blocks from me, but when he came out the street, his street came right straight towards my driveway. So every time he come down here and went out, he had to look at that effigy of him hanging on the fence post. Well, we got a kick because we noticed his car going that way, over and around the football field and back down into town the other way. And so I put a big sign out on the front of my fence, out on the front, saying, I am one pissed grandma. Well, the kids kind of like that. Kids around town kind of like that. But I then, after Miss Timko wouldn't accept Debbie's statements, I went back to town. I got a cosmetology head, and I dressed Miss Timko in the prettiest, brightest, orange flowered outfit you ever saw. I hung this thing around the neck saying, D.A. Timko. I hung her on the other post. I built another one up, and I hung her. They hung an effigy for almost a year there on my gatepost. And every time I'd get pissed about something else that was happening, I'd paint another sign. And it ended up, our house was right next to the baseball soccer field for the high school there in Prairie City. So, about 300 feet of solid board fence was covered with signs. They weren't nasty signs, they were educational signs, such as, girls, do you really want to live with knowing that you caused a boy to be a registered sex offender for life? Another one I put up was, the boys of Grant County are not rapists. It was just signs like that, just to educate. And any visiting teams from out of town, they parked their cars to watch the game. They could go look across the field and read all my signs. So I'm sure out-of-town visitors to games were very entertained by my 300 feet of signs. And, of course, people did say something about taking them down. I got the word around this little town that if anybody touched my signs or my effigies, that I was going to file suit for destruction of property and First Amendment constitutional rights, because the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled that hanging an effigy is a freedom of speech. So they knew they couldn't touch the effigies or the signs. So anyhow, that went on for almost a year. And of course, the people in that town thought this woman from outside was an absolute nut, but I really don't care what people think of me. And they stayed there. Well, it got to where they finally set a court date that Drew was to have to appear in court. And he was supposed to plead guilty or not guilty. And I told my daughter, no way, we're not letting it get to that point. Because once it gets to that point, they're going to indict him and it's going to be on his record. So we're going to put a stop to it before it ever happens. So we got Pamela Gaston's sui juris book out. Comes in very handy when you need to file your own papers. We filed a motion to dismiss. We had 7 reasons to dismiss and 23 accompanying documents. And we took them down to the courthouse and turned them in to the records gal to put in the judge's folder. And we went to court the next morning. Well, when the judge opened his folder, first thing he sees is this motion to dismiss, and that I and my daughter are sitting at the defense table with my grandson. And he said, well, I see that you've got a motion to dismiss. And he said, it looks quite extensive, so I'm going to have to give Miss Timko some time to decide what she wants to do about this. And he said, and I also court appoint an attorney for any juvenile. He said, you gals can continue this if you want to, but he said, I'm appointing Mr. Sorio as Drew's defense. And we said that was fine because he had defended Hezekiah, and Hezekiah had been found not guilty. So we didn't mind them court appointing an attorney as long as he didn't interfere with us. And we knew he wouldn't. And so in about 3 weeks, Drew received a letter at my house. His mail came to my house because he was living with us. And it was from Miss Timko. And she said, I am going to allow Mr. Meekum, Drew, to take a polygraph test. And I am going to appoint the polygrapher, and I am going to decide on the questions being asked. I called Debbie. I said, there is no way in hell that some state-paid agent is going to polygraph my grandson. You find a good polygrapher, and I'll pay for it. So she got on the internet, and she found a guy in Salem who was, I believe, the former polygrapher for the Salem police for their rape and murder cases. She talked to him. She told him what was happening. He said, you've got to get him over here. You've got to have a polygraph test before you go to court. And we're supposed to be going to court in about 3 days. So I called a friend who was a pilot, and I said, can you fly us to Salem tomorrow? This guy said, I'll set aside everything and do the polygraph tomorrow. And so the guy said, yeah, I'll take him to Salem. I'll take him to Canada or anywhere else he needs to go, and I'll go with him. Because everybody that knew us was pretty pissed off about this, everything that was going on. So we all jumped in his plane the next day and went to Salem, and Drew was with the polygrapher for 4 hours. He came out and he told my daughter, he said, he passed with flying colors. He said, they can't even play with this and even get it anywhere near inconclusive. That's how totally he's passed this test. So we're flying back in the night, and got there, but he said, for chain of evidence, I am going to have to fax it, fax this to Mr. Sorio's office, and Mr. Sorio will have to take it to court because he's the court-appointed attorney. Fine. So the next morning we went in, and Debbie told Mr. Sorio, she said, in a few minutes there's going to be a fax coming in on your machine, and you will take it to court this morning in Drew's case. So when it came on, he kind of smiled a little bit. I think he was kind of happy about what we had done. It's just that he couldn't have advised us to do that. Because if he had advised us to go against the district attorney, he could have been taken before a disbarment hearing. So before we did this, we told Drew not to tell anybody we were doing it, not even to tell his little brother and sister. Not to tell anybody, because we didn't want anybody to know that we were doing this against the wishes of the district attorney. So we got into court. The judge looked at it and said, well, I see Mr. Meekum has had a polygraph test. I am going to have to give Mrs. Timko some time to decide what she wants to do about this. So he postponed it for another month. Mrs. McKenzie, no, she was over there with Miss Timko. Christy Timko was the DA. She stood up at that point and she said, Your Honor, we gave Miss McKenzie a polygraph test and she passed. Now, if we hadn't taken Drew for an independent polygraph test, he would have been put in handcuffs right then and there on the word of Christy Timko. But thank God we knew enough to do what we had to do. So the judge postponed it for a month. I called our polygrapher in Salem, and I said, Miss Timko just stood up in court and said Miss McKenzie passed her polygraph test. Now, can you tell me how this could happen? You said Drew passed his. He said, I have been a polygrapher for almost 50 years. He said, I know that no two people can be telling the opposite side of a story and both of them be telling the truth. And I said, well, would you take a look at Miss McKenzie's polygraph test and see what you see? What's going on? I said, I'll pay you. He said, you don't need to pay me. He said, I'd gladly look at it. And he said, but what you got to do is you got to tell Miss Timko, Christy Timko, to have her polygrapher fax it to me directly for chain of evidence reasons. So we said, fine. I called Debbie, told her what she needed to do. She called Miss Timko's office, and she told her, I need you to get Ms. McKenzie's polygraph test and fax it. Have your polygrapher fax it to our polygrapher over in Salem. He wants to look at it. Well, I guess you know, the whole case was dismissed before we ever appeared in court again. My question is, why would a woman do that to a 15-year-old boy? Why would she deliberately try to convict an innocent 15-year-old boy and destroy his life? I think maybe she's trying to climb the ladder to higher things. I don't know. But it's beyond me as to why anybody would deliberately set out to destroy a boy's life. If we hadn't done what we did, and if we hadn't fought the battle that we did, I have no doubt that that girl would have stuck to her story because she was too afraid to admit the truth to her uncle. She would have stuck to it, and he would have been convicted. He would have been in prison for years. He would have been a registered sex offender for life. But because I can't say we're experts, but we've been battling these battles for about 20 years. So thank God we knew what to do and how to do it. And the Sui Juris book that Gaston's put out is really a good book to figure out what you need to do and how you need to do it. But I cannot, well, Mrs. Timko, she was not re-elected. Well, Ryan Joslin was elected in the next, in 2010, I believe. No, 2008. Because I was over in Cresswell after my brother had died. We had to move for his dialysis and stuff, and he did pass away June of 2007. I was living in Cresswell in early 2008, and I decided that since I no longer had my brother to take care of 24/7, that I could get back to this case and do something about it. And so I wrote a letter to the new attorney, to the new district attorney, Ryan Joslin. And I told him that I was going to be requesting a FOIA discovery for the what had happened in our family and other, like selective prosecution, dereliction of duty, all this kind of stuff. I wrote quite a long, extensive letter to him. His receptionist wrote me back and said, Mr. Joslin will not be communicating with you via phone or mail. If you wish to have further connection with him, you'll need to make an appointment. So I decided I'd move back to Prairie City and make an appointment with him. But by the time I got moved back over there, they must have had one heck of a town hall meeting, because Jim Wood and his family sold out, and they had gone to Coos Bay. I heard that he was in Coos Bay as a police officer there. When I got back there was a U-Haul truck behind his mother's house, and I asked somebody what was going on. They said, oh, Jim's family's moved. His mother sold out. They're all moving. So this family that had been there, I guess, all their lives, moved out. And another thing that I had decided on doing was, in this action against the county, the state, and the town of Prairie City, was to incorporate my sister's case into it that had happened to her there in Prairie City. She moved to Prairie City in 2002. She had, her youngest daughter was in a really serious car wreck in Washington, Pierce County, Washington. And so Elaine and Alvin, my sister and brother-in-law, had her two little boys. They were 5 and 6 years old. And they were both special needs kids, in that the oldest boy, Marty, has Asperger's syndrome. And the younger one, Patrick, I don't know, special needs of some kind. Anyhow, they were both special needs boys. And my sister knew that there might be some problems with a younger sister of ours who got into drugs when she was about 30 years old. She's now in her 60s. But she's been pretty crazy. We haven't had any communication with her. But she had had those boys shortly after Mindy had the wreck, and she wanted to keep them because she knew they'd bring in money. And so when my sister ended up with them away from her, she knew that that crazy sister of ours and her perverted husband, pedophile husband, drug-dealing pedophile from Pierce County, might come down and try to kidnap the boys. So she called Jim Wood. She'd never met him in person, but she called him and told him there might be a problem. You know, this couple might come down and try to kidnap these two boys from us. Jim told her, don't worry about it. There ain't any kids leaving this county unless I say so, this town. And he said, and I know all the judges and I know their signatures, so if anybody shows up with any kind of a court order, it better be legal. So Elaine thought she was safe. Well, that Saturday evening, there was a knock on the door, and her husband opened the door. Her husband's about 5'5", she's about 5'1". They're little people. And this officer comes in, and Alvin says, come on in. He thought that they were there in answer to their call for help, you know, in helping in this situation. And the guy comes in, there's another officer behind him, and our crazy sister behind him. And they're saying, these kids are going to be taken. These people have custody of them, and they're going to be taken. And if you try to interfere, we will arrest you. And they literally restrained my sister and her husband while they helped Linda Loke get those kids out of that house, got them in the back of their car with my sister going bonkers because we've known for 20 or 30 years the guys with a pedophile. We knew they were drug dealers. And my sister couldn't make sense with those guys. So she's screaming for Jim Wood. And no answer. You know, Jim Wood's nowhere to be found. So she dials 911 trying to get help to keep her grandkids from being kidnapped. And the 911 person, whoever it was, said, who's there? And she said, a state police officer and a sheriff's deputy is here. And she says, well, you've already got police on the scene, so you don't need me. And she hung up on her. Well, they got away with the kids that night. And early the next morning, my sister called me, just hysterical. Her grandkids had been kidnapped. And so I started making phone calls. And I called the head of the state police in Ontario, and I told him what was going on. I called the police chief of there in John Day. And nobody would help because it was a police-assisted kidnapping. And so I found Chris Camerino was a reserve police officer that ran around with Jim Wood all the time. So I cornered him and downtown, and I said, what went on here? And he said, well, we were sitting down the street in the dark. We could hear your sister calling for Jim. And I said, then why didn't Jim help her? And he said, well, Jim's not the police chief. The police chief had already been fired, you know, not too long before that. He was gone. And so Jim was not the police chief, so he didn't have the authority to intervene because either the sheriff's deputy or the state police patrol officer had called him on the car radio and said, stand by, we're going to take these children. And don't interfere. You're too closely related to this case, so just stand by and we'll be the ones to take these kids. And so he stood by in his car, listening for my sister screaming for his help. And I said, Chris, why wouldn't Jim help? Elaine had told him there was a problem. And he said, well, he's not the police chief, so there was nothing he could do. I said, in the absence of a police chief in a town, the mayor is the police chief. So why wasn't the mayor called? And he said, oh, I didn't know that. Well, my sister and I went down to City Hall, and we said, we want to talk to the mayor. So the gal called the mayor. We went to a back room. And we was telling him what had happened with this kidnapping the night before. And I told him what I had told Chris. In the absence of a police chief, the mayor is police chief. And he said, you're right. I should have been called. So he said, call Ms. Timko, and she has the authority to put out a warrant. call her and tell her to put out a warrant on David and Linda Loke. And so my sister calls the district attorney, and her assistant says Miss Timko isn't going to get involved because this is a civil matter. My sister says, since when is a kidnapping across state lines a civil matter? Well, they wouldn't talk to her. They just hung up on her. So my sister and her husband took off for Pierce County, Washington to try to file their own papers because their own Social Security. They didn't have the money to hire an attorney or anything, and their daughter was too sick to intervene. And so they headed up there. And they went up there 3 different times in 6 weeks trying to get it into court in Pierce County. And when they finally got a court date set, my brother-in-law was too sick to go. He was pretty much bedridden at that point. So I went with her. And we were in court all day that day, and our case was the last case of the day. And in the interim, my younger sister had shown up outside in the podium where I was waiting for her. And I walked up to her and I said, "What do you think you're doing kidnapping your own sister's kids?" And she said, "Those kids need me. They're special needs." And I said, "Those kids need you like they need a hole in the head." And so needless to say, we're screaming at each other out in the podium of the courthouse while court's going on. But we ended up back in the courtroom. And when it came to our court case, everybody else was out of the courtroom, and here come an armed police guard into the courtroom, standing there. And I knew the judge had called him because he knew there was a lot of hostility going on in this case. And needless to say, my sister ended up with her kids. In fact, the judge asked Linda, said, "You have turned in all of your police reports?" "Yeah." "You've turned in everything against your husband?" "Yes." He says, "Well, I see a court case here on the computer that I am not sure that's been explained." So he says, "I'm going to take a few minutes to decide what this case is about." He came back a few minutes later and he said, "Ms. Loke, you did not tell me all of your husband's police reports." He said, "There is a case here of child molestation." And she says, "But he did." He said, "Don't try to tell me what he didn't do. It's on the record. They just couldn't get it to a felony level." So it was a misdemeanor or something, inappropriate touching or something. But the judge wrote the order, his secretary wrote the order out for us to go get those kids at the Loke's house. He told the deputy that was there in the courtroom, he said, "Escort Mrs. Loke out to her car and make sure she's gone before you come back and get the rest of these people and escort them to their vehicle." And he wrote, my sister was to go get those boys immediately, forthwith, right as soon as we're out of court. And so we said, do we get any police assistance? He said, "Just call the state police and have them escort you." Well, on the way out, I'm driving. My sister's on the phone calling the state police. Well, they say, did the judge sign an order for us to escort you?" "Well, no, he just told us to call you." "Well, we cannot escort you unless we have a signed court order." So she hung that up and called the sheriff. So I got the same thing. The sheriff wouldn't escort us unless we had a signed court order. Well, we went to get them without police escort. And I think my little younger sister's got enough brains that she didn't try to interfere. So she hasn't destroyed all of her brain cells yet. But since then, just this last year or so, her husband has been under indictment in Pierce County, Washington for sodomy of her youngest granddaughter, who was 7 years old. And he's also been under indictment in Douglas County, Oregon, for rape of a minor child. Because evidently they went down to visit her youngest daughter, who has this 7-year-old girl, and during the night he was trying to penally molest that child in the middle of the night. In Washington, it was digital. But in a year, that he's been under indictment on charges in Pierce County, Washington, where my sister has always bragged about the fact that her husband was a protected entity in Pierce County, Washington, because he is a meth manufacturer and a dealer for the police in that area. So she's bragged about that for years, that he is a protected entity in Pierce County, Washington. So I think that needs to be looked into. Douglas County tried to work with Pierce County. Douglas County, Oregon tried to work with Pierce County for a year in getting this guy convicted. They finally gave up and convicted him in Roseburg without Pierce County, Washington being involved. Thank goodness. He's should be 20 to 25 years at least for what they got him convicted on in Douglas County, Oregon. But so far, in Pierce County, Washington, his criminal case has been postponed at least 9 times. I've been involved in a lot of criminal cases and stuff. I've never known a person's criminal case of rape of a child being postponed 9 times. Maybe I've lost count. Maybe it's been more than that, because he still hasn't been convicted in Pierce County, Washington. Thank goodness. Douglas County did it. But he has been molesting children ever since his stepdaughters were little. They're my nieces. They've told me about it since they've grown. That guy was molesting them when they were little. And my sister has been protecting her stupid husband all that time. She's known it. And she's still protecting. I don't know why she isn't behind bars. It would be a relief to the family if somebody would do something about that crazy broad.
She'll run a prostitution ring.
Yeah. So anyhow, now I'm advertising to Grant County and to the Oregon State Police. Let's see. The state police officer that was involved in the kidnapping was Cody Weaver, Oregon State Police. The sheriff's deputy that was involved in the assisted kidnapping of Marty and Patrick was Todd McKinley. Jim Wood was the police in Prairie City. Anyhow, I'm naming names because this stupidity has got to stop. I mean, you people have got to start doing what's best for the citizens, not for your paychecks or whatever the heck the reason is that you're kidnapping kids and giving them to drug-dealing pedophiles. So, thank you for listening to my grumpy testimony.
It was very, very interesting. I mean, it seemed like something that you.
Another thing I wanted to add to this little story was, since Miss McKenzie supposedly passed her polygraph test, she has been telling friends around town that the reason she was able to pass is because of the questions that was asked her. She was asked, has Drew ever been in your bedroom? Yes, he has been. They grew up from the time they was babies together, slept in bunk beds together in the same room. She was asked, how many times has Drew been in your bedroom more than once? Yes. That was the truth. They played on the computer together all the time. She was asked, did Drew spend the night at yours and your Uncle Chris's house the night in question? Yes, he did. Because he had an away game the next morning. He stayed at Uncle Chris's so he could go across the street and catch the school bus going to a game at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So that's why you should not ever trust a state-paid agent to do your polygraph or anything like that. You've got to do your own private, and then you have them in hand. You pay for them, you have them in hand. Otherwise, they will be manipulated. When she wrote the letter and said that Drew could take a polygraph, that she would choose the polygrapher and that she would decide on the questions asked, that's why I knew that we had to do it privately, because I know that they manipulate the questions that are asked to get the answers they want. So that's just a little tidbit of information I wanted to give to everybody out there. Spend a little money, get your own private detectives, your own private polygraphs. And you can present polygraphs in court. Don't let them tell you you can't. You can. You just don't have to if you don't want to. But if you want to, you can. Thank you.